Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Gentella Benson. I'm the author of the novel Hope and Glory and head of editorial at Black Ballad. And today I'll be your chair for this event hosted by the RSA. I'm delighted to be joined by Jimi Famurewa. Welcome, Jimi.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Immaculate pronunciation of my surname. I feel like I have to always say it because I appreciate it each time.
No, I mean, we have to represent for the Nigerians in the house. Now, if you don't know Jimi is a British Nigerian author and broadcaster. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, Wired, and more. He's a restaurant critic for the Evening Standard and is a regular guest judge on BBC One series, MasterChef. In 2021, he won Restaurant Writer of the Year at both the Fortnum and Mason Awards and the Guild of Food Writers Awards. And he's also the author of the brilliant new book, Settlers, Journeys Through the Food, Faith and Culture of Black African London. And the research and ideas from Settlers will be the subject of our discussion today. Now, before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. If you're watching along live, we'd love for you to get involved in the live chat. Please do share your thoughts and comments. And if you're on Twitter, you can use the hashtag RSA Journeys. But if you haven't already read Settlers, I highly recommend you do. It really is a great book and the research is enlightening and thorough, and it's also just really great to read, which I think is important for a nonfiction book. So I think it's a great time to also be reflecting on Black African London as well, given the increasing influence that the African diaspora is having on British culture, whether that's music, entertainment, food, or fashion. And I want to get started by asking you, Jimi, to walk us through some of the historical events, political decisions, and cultural moments that have shaped the culture and community of Black African London as it exists today.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way you put it is absolutely right. Like there's all sorts of different historical moments, I think, which was what I found throughout the course of researching the book and kind of working on Settlers for quite a long period and delving as far as I could go. I guess primarily I started with my own story, my own family's kind of arrival, which was in the early 80s, kind of late 70s, that period. And that, I would say, is tied into the post-war wave, really, that first, well, not first wave, but that really pivotal wave of a lot of African overseas students, people from former British colonies. And it was at that time that a lot of these nations were on the path towards independence. And so what's really fascinating about that is that there was a big drive, there was real encouragement in a similar way to the way that the Windrush generation, you know, it's really pivotal to note that they were kind of answering the call, that they were coming to the UK, to cities like London, to kind of help with a labour shortage and help rebuild the country. In a similar way, these primarily student immigrants that came from countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and other places across the continent were kind of coming here because they were sort of being invited by bodies like the Colonial Office to kind of learn how to run these independent countries. And also I just discovered through the course of my research, they're obviously being invited in a bid to almost maintain some soft power, to kind of maintain influence over these subjects that are going to be kind of, you know, leaving the empire, really. So that's really politically interesting in itself. And that's probably at the heart of the story that I look at in Settlers, because that's the modern history, really, that possibly hasn't been scrutinized to the same degree as Windrush, because it's kind of far better established. And, you know, the Caribbean community were far and away the majority Black community in the UK throughout that post-war period. And so that really kind of set the texture of how a lot of us kind of view like Black Britishness. And so that was one of the things I wanted to hone in on. But the thing I would add to that is that through the course of my research, I just found out that there were so many other kind of moments. You know, there's the turn of the century, early 20th century, and kind of around the lead up and after the First World War, where there was a lot of Somali and East African seamen generally, like in places like Liverpool and the East End of London, that were effectively like stranded here. And so, you know, they kind of couldn't really get back home. And so they had built up these communities as well. And there's a really big sort of interwar community as well in the 1930s of African immigrants, kind of, you know, budding politicians, political agitators that kind of came to London, musicians, thinkers. And so that is the point that I would make, really. And it's something that was news to me, or that I didn't really appreciate fully until I researched the book, is that it's not just about the post-war story. Although it's the heart of the book, hopefully you see those and feel those other historical reverberations. And the running theme really is that there was always a reason and a wider context for why African communities were making their home here.
Yes, definitely. And I like how, well, I relate personally to when you're talking about your own upbringing as a British Nigerian, especially given that so much of Black British culture felt growing up that it was defined by Caribbean culture. So from your experience, what were some of the tensions of being Black British Nigerian, and how is that different to maybe how past generations formed their identities as Nigerians or Africans in the UK?
Yeah, I really that was one of the key things that I didn't want to shy away from, and I wanted to kind of talk about. And I keep making this point, but I think one of the things that emboldened me, that I could sort of, you know, grasp that quite tricky nettle of looking at historic interaction between different Black communities in the UK, was because I knew that I was heading for a kind of positive endpoint, which is like the position we're in today, where I feel like there's so many amazing signs of this hybrid kind of Black Britishness that kind of takes from different specific cultures in a really free, positive way. And there's this kind of real galvanized strength that I feel. So I felt like that was something that I could delve into the route to that point with the freedom that I knew that it was heading to this place that was, in my opinion, like a broadly positive thing. From my point of view, growing up, and I kind of delve into this, I think it was all just kind of, you know, there was bullying at school. Like I had no clue. I described this in the book, but and other people of African heritage that I spoke to, not just through the course of doing Settlers, but, you know, throughout other interviews as a journalist, that this had been like a kind of muttered aside that a lot of people in the Black community were talking about, but wasn't really known outside of our kind of diaspora and our spaces and kind of those kind of community spaces, was that it was just like quite an established thing that you know, you had this moment where, you know, I grew up very aware of how Nigerian we were. We were like Nigerian in the sort of like most loud, out and proud way imaginable. But then I went to school and you suddenly realize you get told, or you're informed by other people, oh, it's not a cool thing to be. It's not a desirable thing to be. You are associated with, I always felt it. I don't know if this is just something I realized in later life or something that I fully could articulate at the time. It felt like, you know, an immigrant pecking order, really. Like, and I think there's going to be various forms of that across all sorts of communities, aren't there? Like that feeling of, you are the recently arrived, conspicuously foreign, you know, you don't get it kind of thing. And that was my sense of it as a kid. And obviously you look around as well, and I delved a bit deeper into this, and just in terms of the culture, like, you know, it was famine, you know, what African heritage kind of was allied with or represented. It was, you know, it was famine. It was kind of, you know, finger wagging, overeducated adult students, like, you know, like kind of, you know, like I think of Desmond's, the great Channel 4 sitcom. And it was these kind of figures of fun, really. There wasn't cool. It was an undesirable thing. And I think because of the environment I grew up in, which was probably predominantly, although it was, you know, the Black students in my school, South Asian students, it was kind of mixed. It was the edge of Southeast London. it was probably a predominantly white environment, and growing up in a kind of predominantly white culture, when what was prized was assimilation, was blending in, was kind of, you know, sanding off those edges, like your ability to pass and to not be this kind of foreigner, as it were. And I think I was really aware of that kind of growing up, and I always feel that I kind of look at this in the book, and it's been interesting to have these conversations and unpack it even further. I always felt that my culture and the African culture that I grew up in, our language, our food, our traditions, was so kind of strong, and so kind of, there was no sense of me ever moving away from it. It was such a kind of governing force in my life that I felt like I probably viewed it with too much ambivalence. I don't think I was ever like fully like ashamed of it. I was just like, God, this is there. I don't question it. Like, I don't think I'll ever lose that link to it. So I probably didn't nurture it, and I didn't have the interest or curiosity that I then had in later years. And I see kind of reflected in the Black British community now, and Settlers really comes from that desire to kind of know more and unpack that route to a kind of something that you wouldn't necessarily scream from the rooftops, to something that is a source of real pride now and importance for so many people, and almost, you know, people that have lost those ancestral links, have got Caribbean heritage, are now far more interested in finding out more about, you know, their kind of culture and heritage, you know, before enslavement, and their ancestry in that way. So yeah, that's my own personal route, and the route that I tried to map throughout the book.
Have you found through your research that past generations maybe had a different relationship with identity coming to the UK compared to, I guess technically we're like first generation. I'm never sure if we're first generation, second generation,
Yeah.
but did you find that there's a difference?
Yeah, I think that there was always that slightly confusing thing, and this is true in Caribbean culture as well, and part of that Windrush generation of Englishness, or proximity to Englishness, and facility with English language being prized, and being able to assimilate and pass, being this thing that I think even in my mum's kind of generation, and before that, and throughout the course of my research, it did seem, and obviously this is slightly coloured by the fact that if we're talking about people of African heritage coming to the country, particularly in that post-war wave, a lot of them would have been, you know, upper class, or upper to middle to upper class people of means that were able to travel, and also, you know, obviously one of the chapters looks at education, and, you know, the number, not huge amounts, but significant Black Africans choosing to send their children to these private schools. And I think that is kind of that strange judo of wanting to have the benefits of Englishness, or being Western or whiteness, but also being very of your culture. And so I feel like there was probably a lot more, if we just hone in on that immediate post-war era, there was probably a lot more just like real pride, and real kind of like, no, this is important, you can't disrespect us. And I looked at one of the really formative moments in that 20th century history of African settlement, in Black African settlement in London, especially, and in the UK, is I think it was like the 1920s or 1930s, and it's the Empire, you know, the Empire exhibition that celebrates like Empire, and all these Black African students from what would become the West African Students' Union, they protested the representation of African culture. There were all these stories in the lead up to that exhibition, which was up by Wembley, and literally featured like living villages, like, you know, peopled with Nigerians that were specially like flown over and kind of recreated village life, and with these living exhibits. And there was a group of young students that were so incensed and so kind of articulate enough, because of their education, their class, to really put across the problem that they had with how their culture was being misrepresented. And so I think probably there was, if you chart it across the century, there was like that real pride and that pushback that maybe, yeah, in my generation was kind of, you know, a lot more kind of went in its shell a little bit. And there was like, there was a lot more, you know, I literally speak to people in that chapter that talk about being in the closet effectively as Africans, and kind of having different names, you know, as they were at school, and kind of saying that they were from Barbados, or they were from Jamaica or whatever. And I kind of think, you know, I hopefully that chapter, I tease out the kind of comedy of that, because it just feels like preposterous, but also show you why kind of, you know, people felt that, you know, like your heritage and your culture put such a target on your back that you felt you needed to at least kind of conceal it. And that, I would say, is in stark contrast to, you know, let's say, you know, 70, 80 years earlier, African students literally fighting to kind of, you know, put forward the pride in their heritage and who they really were, and correct the record really in the face of stereotypes and stigmas around what it was to be African, and all these kind of accusations of cannibalism and whatever else was going on at that time.
Yeah, I think it's really important, as you mentioned, kind of like the class difference there. And I'd like to pick up on that, because I think so much of the conversation around Black communities in the UK, a lot of the nuance gets lost, and we're kind of spoken about as this monolith. One of those like monolithic attributes that we're all given, for example, is that we're all working class. But Nigerians in particular have a very specific or interesting relationship with class that often gets overlooked when we're all assumed to be like from working class backgrounds. So what impact do you think that British and Nigerian ideas of class have had on Black African communities in London, but also across the UK?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, that notion of trying to disseminate and pull apart this monolith. That was a real driver for this book, and kind of, you know, we've all felt that thing of feeling like you're denied individuality, and your own situation is not reflected in kind of, you know, what people speak about when they think of Black Britons in relation to class, especially. Yeah, I think I was always just very keenly aware of it, and it was linked. You know, all the chapters are linked, and they cover, you know, a variety of subjects, and I think that's no accident. My mum's status as being middle class, striving towards upper middle class, was really linked to, you know, her religion, her relationship to education, and all these things that became the kind of the defining traits of our upbringing. As I said, you do tend to see around the time that those defining arrivals of overseas students from African nations around the 1950s especially happens, that the class of those people and their supposed you know, their education and the fact they're coming here to like improve themselves, that really filters into how Black Africans and especially West Africans see themselves. But what really fascinated me was that, you know, a lot of the tensions, I think, and a lot of the kind of the difficulties or the solutions that Black African settlers have come up with to life in diaspora in the UK and in cities like London, comes from that feeling like you're one class or like you're one thing, and arriving in a new country and being, you know, however many rungs lower down like the ladder than you expect. And so there's this kind of glitch of status, and like kind of people have this idea about who they are. And I think it's a really interesting thing. I don't know to what degree anyone really in the sort of Black African culture that I grew up in would articulate like a pride in being working class. I think, you know, obviously people would probably do that in all sorts of different ways and kind of would just like live their lives. But I just feel like, particularly in Nigeria, in my experience, there's this huge, really ambitious, aspirational middle class, and you can live for all that Nigeria is a country with all manner of social challenges, you know, there is this history of, you know, having domestic servants, having like a compound, having sending people to private schools, like all these things that maybe in a different cultural environment are viewed of as, you know, representative of high status or a certain class, accessible to a greater range of people. And so I think you arrive in this country and you have this sense of yourself, and then you're not able to live in that way, and you're not regarded in that way, and so much kind of the so much difficulty kind of springs from that, right? And I think of, like, you know, my mum working multiple jobs, and there was an interviewee in Settlers who was a mother of a young man and a young woman who go to grammar school, and she'd set them on this path. The family's entire life was set up around, you know, sending these kids on this path to grammar school and kind of giving them 11+ kind of tutoring, and kind of like really almost trying to get as close as possible to a private education without the fees, like, you know, to really, you know, work the system in that way. And she kind of literally said to me, like, you know, where I'm from and how I kind of see myself, you know, we come to this country and we're driving cabs, we're cleaning, we're working, we're doing like care jobs and things like that. But she was like, but that's not how that doesn't connect with the person that I was, or that I feel that I still am, you know, in diaspora. And that was a really interesting idea to me, that I don't know if I really fully anticipated being such a big factor, that this glitch in class is such a huge fact of, you know, so much of what we see as kind of Black African life in the UK. And yeah, it's such a huge thing, you know, like yeah, particularly in Nigerian communities, this notion of class and respect, and, you know, you only need to go to a kind of traditional party or you know, engagement ceremony like a Nigerian one, and all the kind of intricacies of who gets served first and who sits where, like, you know, it's class, but it is also this status obsessed society, and that interacting with the chaos really of and struggle of life in diaspora, and the different forces that Black families kind of came into contact with when they started to settle here more and more, is, you know, is the reason for so much of what we see in terms of Black British life.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just thinking about those parties where, you know, the uncle will be introduced to speak and he's got a million different titles, doctor, chief, etc., before the name. It is such a, it's just such a imprint, I think, of life.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people just, again, this is almost what I was trying to do with the book. Maybe if I couldn't even fully articulate it right away, is just, you know, all these things that we talk about, that not just Black African communities talk about, but probably apply to other immigrant communities, and like all the Black British diaspora kind of talk about, just been sort of lurking in the shadows. And I just kind of wanted to, like, kind of let it out there really, and just kind of let people and delve into it a little bit for my own sake as much as other people's. And, you know, little things like the bow, the deferent bow that you do in Nigerian, like Yoruba culture, like especially. And I think of my mum, and she, like, basically, we wouldn't do the bow, we wouldn't kind of do that. So basically you do this deferential bow to like an elder, to kind of to show your respect and to prostrate yourself before them. But we never did that. We never grew up doing that. And I feel like, again, it's that question of how much of it is just the individual person raising you, and how much of that is their kind of sense of self and social conditioning and class and stuff. And that to itself seems interestingly tied to like having a Western education, or being seen as speaking properly, or having kind of money or means, or having your worldview broadened by travel. And so, yeah, there's a whole other book to be written on class, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely. That is that feels like thesis material in and of
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
But taking that aspirational kind of like theme, another way that this often translates in immigrant communities is around entrepreneurship, and that as a almost hallmark and necessity of the immigrant experience. So could you speak a bit more to how entrepreneurship plays a role in Black African communities in London?
Yeah, this was another really sort of like rich kind of part of the story that really always really just came from, you know, for as long as I've been alive, like everyone around me, every kind of family gathering has been, you know, uncles kind of loudly talking about their business plans and what they're going to do. And my mum's got a business that she wants to get going, and kind of, and you know, and that was just kind of enriched by having more conversations with people. Again, in that classroom chapter, I spoke to, you know, she's essentially an educator, or like after school club entrepreneur who, you know, was training to be a barrister. But she said to me, oh, and she started this whole entire business to effectively offer after school teaching and tutoring services to predominantly Black African children, like looking to get into grammar schools or improve their grades. And she just said to me, look, we had more than enough, like her and her husband, like, you know, they kind of were earning more than enough. But to her, she was like, you know, we as people, she was saying, speaking of Nigerians, are just entrepreneurial. We kind of we want more. We want to kind of, you know, like get on. We want to strive. We want to reach some next level. And I think the thing that I really hit upon that interests me was also within that. And again, this applies across all sorts of different communities, is that need to be your own boss, that need for agency comes from wanting to get some power in a world and in a situation where you know repeatedly feel powerless, and like you want to and I think that is like a big drive of it. And actually you could say that focus and that kind of head down attitude that's very prevalent in Black African, especially West African communities, you know, leads to all sorts of you know, slightly kind of damaging, or like you hold yourself back in strange ways, because, you know, you're not really noticing like any kind of societal obstacles that you're facing. You're so kind of eyes on the prize. And that really interested me, like that there was this kind of self-starting culture that was kind of, you know, really enshrined. And then I guess the flip side of that, which I explore in the market chapter, is, you know, there is entrepreneurship and there is this kind of hustle that we all kind of grow up quite steeped in. And it's funny, just as an aside, because me and my brothers will talk about, you know, feeling like we're quite separate from this, but then we look around, like me and my cousins that are my age and my older brother, and almost all of us are freelance or self-employed. So it's interesting that it manifests. You think like, oh my God, like you're joking about your uncles and their crackpot schemes, and then you've effectively become them. But yeah, the flip side of that came out in the market chapter, where I look at, you know, the sort of battle for produce, to kind of find those tropical foodstuffs and ingredients, but also that sense of home, and like kind of represented in markets like Ridley Road and Brixton and Peckham and places like that. And the thing that I really realized through that is that it's about entrepreneurship, it's about making money, it's about turning something, or the cultural insight that's maybe a disadvantage in the world, in the English world, in the Western world, you know, things like your accent, your, you know, your facility with English, your kind of the fact that you're accustomed to a way of life that is different, flipping that round and turning that into a benefit, and also that those being really important businesses and spaces for the community. And so they're kind of, it's really interesting to me that there is that kind of quite focused hustle, eyes on the prize, like self-starting thing that's quite individualistic. But really, when you look at like the shopkeepers that I was interviewing and speaking to, even people that run restaurants, even whether it's, the way that Pentecostal churches interact with entrepreneurship, really, in our examples of successful businesses, it serves the community in a broader way, like, and it kind of that entrepreneurship starts to have a collective benefit as well.
And I think it's impossible to speak about Black African communities in the UK, in London in particular, and not talk about gentrification, because it really is just changing the dynamics of communities. And as land becomes more expensive and people are like having to move and shift all over the place, basically. But what role do places like restaurants and places of worship and even shops, as you've mentioned, what role do these like community spaces play in bringing people together and fostering a community in a city that is just growing increasingly expensive and harder to do so?
Yeah, the role is huge. Like, as I say, there is, although these things are individual businesses, they are these kind of really vitally important collective endeavors as well. And it's really interesting to me that, like, so much of my life, and this is probably tied to that kind of I almost want to say, like, resentful attitude to kind of the specificities of your culture, like being dragged to the complete other side of Southeast London alongside my mum to get a specific cut of meat from a butcher that knows the way she wants it, because she had it like that back home, or to get yams or to get plantains, and or me in a more individual way having to go from, like, my sort of home on the edge of Kent, like all the way across to like South London to go to my barber. But then you realize that in the same way as I go to my barber, I would go to my childhood barber for not just a specific way of cutting my hair, but a specific interaction, a specific environment, a culture and a community belonging to something that I probably couldn't put a name to, but was like vitally important. These spaces fill you up in a way that you can't really measure, to be honest. And that's true of shops, that's true of restaurants that serve a community. But then the flip side, as you say, with gentrification, is that they're individuals. Like I was saying previously, what they do is meaningful and really important. And I really saw it with when I was in these shops and talking to these shopkeepers and seeing the way that people go in there and they interact in their native language. They spot those kind of familiar labels. They ask for favors. They ask someone to help them with something. Like, one shopkeeper is like, he's giving out, recipes for potato leaf stew, like in between sort of telling a woman that she can't haggle the price. So they're these kind of really important vectors for this way of being, but it's just one person, right? And a lot of the time these people, and again, this is really true of all sorts of different immigrant diasporas and communities, these people do these jobs so that their children and the younger generation don't have to. And so that connection and that space becomes jeopardized, doesn't it? Because because of gentrification and kind of places that were once undesirable now not necessarily having the space for a lot of these places, and it just being like a full-time battle to protect these spaces and to enter in these fights and stuff. It's really interesting to me that the fight in places like Ridley Road, say there was the very successful Save Ridley Road campaign. There was a linked, equally successful campaign to save the Latin Village in London. And they were really being spearheaded by younger kind of activists or people kind of outside the community. Like, a lot of the traders didn't have the tools or the language or even, I don't know, that sense of stake in it that they kind of, could fight back properly. So that was quite interesting in itself. And yeah, gentrification, I think I obviously touch on it, but I touch on it from a commercial point of view and looking at market spaces and restaurants and churches and those kind of places and their kind of fight to find a home and find the accessing of space, really. But there's a whole other story with housing, isn't there? Because it's like, you know, you can walk to Peckham now and think, oh, you know, what's the big deal? This still feels like Peckham. But then the point is, generations can't put down roots there. And, you know, the housing isn't accessible. And so that makes everything ever more difficult. The final point I'll make on top of that, though, is, you know, the chapter that looks at housing, suburb. And this goes back to that point of class and maybe being attributed with, I don't know, desires or characteristics that you don't feel reflect who you really are. So many people ended up living in tower blocks or these kind of quite close-knit, like inner London communities, just by necessity, because there was nowhere else to get. And it was really interesting to look at that drift out to the suburbs, which is obviously linked to schooling, but also a lot of the kind of Black African communities that were surveyed or polled, or people that I interviewed, were saying, we want space, we want like a big garden. Like, you know, we've had this almost like geographic identity put on us that, oh, we identify with this area. But actually, you know, it's kind of striking how a lot of these communities, and I'm speaking of like immigrant diasporas and maybe like lower income communities, identify a lot more with, like, say, a retail park, a lovely school nearby that's high rated and going to give your children good opportunities, a big garden, than they do with, you know, the traditional kind of hubs of kind of Black African culture and that immigrant experience in like London. And so that's another interesting little wrinkle to it that I came across.
That's really interesting, actually. Yeah, no, I've never thought of it like that, but it's true.
Yeah, it's just one of those things. And again, one of the great sort of accidental gifts of this book was I just had all these conversations with people through the purpose of doing the book, but you just kind of learn so much, and conversations with my mum as well. And this is directly linked to her sense of who she was and like and self and class, that she chose to move us to, you know, a suburb, like, you know, effectively like kind of right at the edge of like southeast London, where we were like conspicuous, like we were absolutely, I think we were one of two Black families on a very long street, and we were like very much the only West African or Black African family. And she did that with that, you know, with that kind of singular vision of like, oh, you know, what's more important to me is space and good schools, and like I'm not going to be like, you know, that, you know, she just took that decision. And obviously then that has all sorts of ramifications for like me and my siblings and other people that grow up in that situation. But then that speaks to this idea of having this sense of not being dictated to in terms of, and just that kind of constant tussle between what you feel deserving of and what the society you're in sort of feels that you're deserving of as well. So that was really interesting to hear that from her, and it made me rethink a lot of, you know, it's not straightforward, is it? Because there's so much cultural importance in places of significance like Brixton or Peckham, and you know, so many people will be like, this is our home, and it's meaningful because of that long lineage. But then there'll be a lot of people that don't feel attached to it, and probably have, you know, some of the, you know that is what makes gentrification this tricky proposition as well, right? And why we kind of need to keep talking about it and sort of educating ourselves as well, because I admit that I sort of need to like delve a bit deeper into it as well.
Yeah, and I think another aspect which isn't straightforward, but which I like the way that you kind of approached it, because I think it's something that we don't talk about enough, is the fact that a lot of Africans grow up in very like culturally conservative like households where education and respect for authority are kind of like these pillars of our upbringing. But when we encounter the world, the Western world, and then you've got the complication of like structural racism. So these ideas of education and justice and police and authority, it all gets a little bit messy, especially when you've got parents who've grown up in Black majority countries. So they don't even necessarily have a concept of what structural racism is. So can you speak a bit about that kind of like relationship within Black African communities?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important point. And you make a good point about their upbringing being in a majority Black environment. Like, I was really conscious, like, or increasingly conscious after finishing the book, that obviously my view of the themes I write about in Settlers, what it is to be Black, African and British, is so shaped by growing up in a white environment. Like, you know, the people that, you know, I'm thinking of like Edward Enninful's book, where he comes to the country as a refugee at 13, and his interaction and sort of feeling towards the UK is so different to mine, say, like being born here, like coming from that Black majority environment. But yeah, you're right. And I think, you know, culturally conservative is absolutely right. Like, another thing that I kind of checked in with my mum about again, and she kind of had this attitude of, which I definitely recognize from being younger and in other kind of, you know, middle class, striving, aspirant Black African families, of, you know, racism's there, you just focus on it, you know, that thing, that old chestnut that so many people from immigrant families and people of color will have heard, where it's like, oh, you have to work twice as hard to, like, you know, get half as far, and kind of that notion. I have sympathy for that, because, as you say, they were coming from a completely different environment. They didn't really realize, I think, fully like what they were up against. And I think there was that feeling of like, there's nothing you can do about fixing it. So the route to, you know, you just need to be like successful enough that I don't know, is probably quite an individualistic way of looking at it. And what really interested me, and this goes back to that point about, I feel like we're gaining so much right now from solidarity and collectivism, not just between Black Caribbean and Black African communities, but like all kind of like immigrant communities, and kind of almost like comparing notes in a really great way. Because I think what my parents' generation and a lot of the people like that, like, didn't really appreciate was what the Caribbean community had been through, like particularly in terms of education, particularly in interactions with the police. And I think, you know, the mistake, and I definitely, it was definitely a lesson that I, you know, either subconsciously like absorbed or was literally told, was that, you know, there's a way to be where you won't be, you know, the police won't see you, there won't be an issue, head down, focus on, you know, things, racism's there, but there's nothing you can do about it. And it was a real realization for me doing the book, to realize like, wow, like, I've probably gained as a person from that kind of bulletproof attitude of not really kind of second guessing in that way in terms of institutional disadvantage and things like that. And I've probably kind of just been able to kind of move into spaces and act as if I have every right to be there. But then equally, you think, God, wow, like what you've also sort of lost from like holding on to those things, or keeping your head down, or trying to block things out, or trying to kind of contort yourself to help navigate something that is unfair through no fault of your own, right? And so you're almost kind of playing by the rules of this rigged game, aren't you? And so that was something that I kind of came across quite a lot. And I look, I think there's always going to be that kind of conservatism, like particularly in like West African cultures and like middle class cultures, and we see it manifest now through various debates about to what extent politicians of color in the Conservative Party are to be, you know, celebrated as wins for representation without any kind of recourse given to how diverse they are in terms of class, upbringing, and outlook, right? And this kind of is the flip side of that coin, where we're playing to not be a monolith. But I do think that it's a fascinating part of this story that, yeah, there has been that social cultural conservatism. And one thing that I was really interested in was, to what extent can you hold both things in your hand at the same time? Do you know what I mean? To what extent can you be proud of this ancestry and this culture and this heritage that you come from, that really helps you understand who you are? And to what extent can you kind of take on the influences of the Western world and diaspora, and kind of being kind of progressive and open and sort of, you know, honest with yourself in terms of like your emotions and your mental health and things like that, and kind of move forward in that way. And I think that is the thing that I'm encouraged by seeing, and I just hope we see more of, really, that kind of, because I think maybe a flip side of those feelings of ambivalence towards my own like African heritage and culture when I was like a teenager and growing up, quite apart from what was being said about it and bullying and things like that, was probably like, you feel like that culture is owned in some way by your parents' generation and the older generation, and maybe you associate it. I've seen people talk about this. You associate certain characteristics or things that you're not happy about with that culture, and so you become, you know, like a little bit like, oh, like, you know, you feel like you can't claim it for yourself. And what I've seen, and what Settlers hopefully pays tribute to, is people reclaiming it and claiming it for themselves, and sort of managing to be take both pride in that tradition, but also kind of move forward and have a kind of modern sensibility.
I think this is a great time to kind of ask the big picture question. What do you think the future of Black African London might look like, given all the evolutions across culture and community? What do you think it might look like in the future?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think one of the things that I kind of am an optimist. I think, as I say more than once in the book, because you kind of because I feel like I have to be, because I'll just kind of give in otherwise. But one of the things that I hadn't really anticipated was obviously the difficulty in coming to this country. Like, you know, it's got harder and harder, and that you know, post Brexit, like there's all sorts of really crazy figures in terms of, like, you know, the number of visas that are turned down from people in like Black African countries. And so I think you have to acknowledge that it's, you know, you're maybe not going to see the same wave of migration, or it's going to be harder and harder to have those similar waves again. But I feel like what the future of it probably holds is that it just gets increasingly, it just permeates the culture even more. Because I feel like now I really wanted to shine a light on this culture in this world, but I feel like, you know, there's so much more, and I'm seeing not just manifesting in music and film, but all across the board, like more interest in other African nations and different cultures and things like that. And I think that thing, if we go back to that point about what was held against you know, those of African heritage, particularly in the 90s and like the 80s, of being these recent arrivals, like there has been such a kind of growth and permeation of the culture. And I think that as Black Africans become more British, hopefully they will continue to hold on to those sides of themselves. And you can see it in the fact that if we just talk about Black African London, as I hint at in the book, that exists outside of London now. Like, you know, like Black African London is kind of like, you know, Milton Keynes almost now. Like, you know, there's so many figures around, you know, drift out to the suburbs, like kind of people kind of, it just becoming this part of British culture, really. And I think, and I hope that will continue on its own terms as well, like not not in a mode of kind of assimilation or, you know, becoming, you know, sloughing off those like edges and the things that make people African, however they define that, but in sort of being itself, but also part of that greater whole, as I call it. And, you know, Black Britishness being, you know, Black African culture and Black Caribbean culture and all those things at once, and just that rich tapestry carrying on, really. So yeah, that's my hope, but who knows?
A lovely optimistic hope to end on. Thank you so much, Jimmy. It has been great. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, me too. Thank you.
Jimmy's new book, Settlers, is out now. The RSA have provided a discount code for anyone buying the book through Foils. The code is Foils RSA 20, and both the code and the link will be appearing in the live chat right now. But thank you to everyone who's tuned in, and thank you to the RSA for hosting this event. And if you'd like to learn more about the work of the RSA and how to get involved in their global fellowship community, you can visit the rsa.org. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.